be it voluntary or not. Supply from home was the most reliable option if a safe supply route was available. This could be either over water, which was much quicker, by land, or both. The supply trains and boats, however, were a popular target for allies of the besieged city. Thus, a lot of convoy duty was necessary, which affected especially the cavalrymen. All of this was logistically quite challenging, and examples of such systems really working are only found as of the 13th century. Foraging required enormous manpower, exposed the foraging party to attacks, and was unreliable. This was reflected by the prices in the camp's markets. If a foraging party brought back a large amount of food, prices dropped. If their return was delayed, or a couple of forays were unsuccessful, a simple footman might not afford to buy bread. The camp markets were also the main way to integrate the local people into the supply system. The opportunity for profit attracted merchants and others who brought additional supplies to a camp, either directly or via the camp merchants and sutlers, who usually followed an army. In an ideal case, this could amount to a steady flow of goods, most importantly, food brought to the camp. Thus, the soldiers were strictly forbidden to attack or rob merchants. Sometimes the locals were coerced into bringing food to the camp. Sometimes they were easily convinced. Whether it was out of greed or fear, the population of the region often greatly contributed to supplying a besieging army. While some built a camp, gathered supplies, or stood watch, others would focus on the next offensive step. This was usually a combination of bombardment, mining, and negotiations. The goal of these combined efforts was to equalize the advantage of the besieger's superior position. In other words, the goal was to damage the walls and gates. The core of medieval artillery were stone throwers, such as mangonels and traction trebuchets. Though stone was the main ammunition, in some cases various other objects were hurled, from bodies to debris, and in very rare cases, incendiaries. In the 12th century, the counterweight trebuchet was added to the arsenal. In contrast to the traction trebuchet, it was not operated by manpower, that is, by a crew of pullers who hauled simultaneously, but by immense counterweights. These monstrous machines only hurled a few stones per hour, but each shot was powerful compared to earlier variants of this weapon. Both forms of trebuchets and some hybrids were used side by side. While the quicker, smaller traction trebuchets covered the town in a rain of stone, the bigger counterweight trebuchets shot their heavy stones in an unnervingly slow manner but with greater impact. Just how effective an extended bombardment with a counterweight trebuchet could be was demonstrated during the Siege of Acre in 1191. After the attacking Mamluks had bombarded the town for weeks, the walls of the Crusader-held city began to crumble. A machine named God's Stone Thrower reportedly tore a gap of 30 feet in the upper part of the wall. Although the base remained intact and thus a significant barrier remained, this shows that counterweight trebuchets were capable of doing some serious damage. However, according to Clifford Rogers, before gunpowder artillery became effective in the 15th century, siege engines only caused limited damage against sturdy walls of stone. It usually took prolonged bombardments to do serious damage, and still some walls simply couldn't be breached at all. The Chronicle of Hainault, for example, mockingly states that the defenders during the Siege of Dunbar in 1336 used a towel to wipe off the marks the stones had left on the wall. Still, trebuchets were very effective siege engines. They were useful against walls made of less resistant materials and against the less solid parts of the defenses, such as wooden boarding, breastwork, merlons, or sometimes even flanking towers. If these weaker elements of a defensive structure could be destroyed, the wall lost some of its potential as a fighting platform. Another soft target, which was often the focus of the attackers, was the town itself. Usually, more stones were sent over the walls than at them. This did not only cause severe damage, but also put the townspeople under immense pressure, which could result in upheavals against the garrison and eventually surrender. However, the most effective means to bring down a solid wall was deep mining. Miners and sappers usually set out to dig a tunnel from a covered position all the way to the walls, where they made a large cavity stretching under the walls. Then the supporting pillars holding the tunnel and the wall above were covered in oil and the mine filled with combustible materials. When these inflammables were set on fire, the flames would slowly eat away at the supporting pillars until they collapsed together with the wall above. This was, for example, the case at Rochester Castle during the First War of Barons from 1215 to 1217. The castle was captured by a group of rebellious landowners commonly referred to as barons, and then besieged by King John, who was trying to subdue the rebellion. This siege inspired the 2011 movie Ironclad. As shown in the movie, the miners of the king dug a tunnel under the southeast corner of the keep, filled it with brushwood and, unlike in the movie, with the carcasses of 40 pigs. The fire destroyed the supporting pillars, and a large part of the keep collapsed. However, even under ideal conditions, deep mining was very slow. Usually a matter of weeks or months, and if the ground was of solid rock and the water level was too high, it was sometimes even impossible. In addition, the defenders often dug countermines and placed listening posts in cellars to detect enemy miners, and sometimes also vessels of water which would mirror the vibration of digging. When they detected underground enemy activity, they did everything to stop it. While miners were digging their way towards the walls underground, above ground, workers had to fill the ditch or moat of the town so that battering rams, siege towers, or mobile armored shelters, so-called SOS, could be brought up to the wall whenever an attack was called. Although siege towers were reasonably common in long sieges, they were not deployed in the numbers and in the way often portrayed in movies and games. According to the expert on medieval military technology, Kelly de Vries, their main purpose was to protect and elevate archers and crossbowmen rather than boarding the wall. Even though there are cases in which this happened, for example during the fall of Jerusalem in 1099, usually such a tower was constructed on site and built to be higher than the wall, so that the crew could shoot down at the wall, thus suppressing the defenders' firepower. This in turn allowed the troops to climb the wall with ladders and miners to come close to the wall to undermine it directly. Still, most towers included a drawbridge, and some a battering ram on ground level. But a siege tower couldn't simply drive up to the wall, it had to be hauled or pushed there slowly, and thus was not suited for quick assaults. It was, after all, a movable tower, not a vehicle. Kelly de Vries mentions an average speed of 30 meters a day. The weak point of these huge constructions were fire and stone. They had, as Sean McLean puts it, quote, an unnerving propensity to collapse or topple. Stone throwers of any kind could damage the towers, rendering them useless. And although they were usually covered in wet rawhides, they could catch fire and the crew could inevitably burn to death. Even more robust than siege towers were battering rams. Their strong wooden framework had to support the weight of the ram itself, which was in most cases a large tree suspended from a rope or chains. There are rarely any reliable depictions of medieval rams, and written sources usually only mention uncommon features, such as when the end was encased in iron. In many cases, however, rams were protected by a roof which was covered in hides as well. This construction could withstand a lot of small missiles without a problem, but was vulnerable to large stones and incendiary mixtures. It seems, however, that they themselves were only effective against weak spots. Kelly de Vries notes, quote, a wooden gate, no matter how thick, and even a portcullis were vulnerable, but regardless of its size, a battering ram was unlikely to make much of a dent on stone walls that were 2 or 3 meters thick. Regarding such walls, Clifford Rogers adds, quote, one almost gets the impression that they were used more for the sake of trying everything, and in order to worry the defenders, than because they were expected to accomplish anything concrete. While the engineers were preparing the siege engines, the miners digging their tunnels, and the soldiers building the camp, the army's leaders wouldn't remain idle. They would use the well-visible threat of the preparations to persuade the defenders to surrender. If this worked, jackpot. The attackers won an intact town without having to put their men and purse to the strain of a long siege. However, for the defenders, the promise of good treatment in case of quick surrender was equally tempting. In fact, the preparations described previously had the purpose of frightening the defenders just as much as they were paving the way for an assault. Such methods might not convince very determined defenders, but there were always some who had to lose more than others. Chances were that a faction favored surrender, or a traitor was willing to help the attackers to get in. This was, for example, the case during the siege of Antioch in 1098. When the crusader Bohemond of Taranto established a contact with an insider, an Armenian Christian, who held a high position and went by the name Firu. In exchange for money, title and protection, Firu organized for some of the crusaders to scale the towers of the Two Sisters, where he was on guard duty. The crusaders then opened a nearby postern gate and let their comrades in. They quickly overwhelmed the surprised garrison and conquered the town bit by bit. For Firu, however, the events took a bad turn, as the crusaders and the local Armenians massacred thousands of people in the so-called Massacre of Antioch, including Firuz's own brother. While the negotiations of the leaders were usually quite mannered, the common soldiers and townspeople had their own back and forth of threatening each other. The intricate messages they shouted called to mind a mediocre rap battle, most often addressing wives, progeny, and hunger. Quote, "Surrender, knaves, lest you die of hunger and we take your women," end quote. Or quote, "Your wives will not be concerned about your deaths, since they'll have bastard progeny enough," end quote. While this gnashing of teeth is somewhat amusing to a modern viewer, it certainly addressed the deepest fears of a soldier far away from home or encircled in a city with the scaringly real prospect of a sack. Just to be clear, a siege was not a well-ordered, step-by-step procedure in most cases. At least, not yet. There was a whole lot of improvisation. The bombardment of the town, negotiations, the construction of siege towers and filling ditches and mining all went side by side. In addition to these long-term preparations, which had mostly the goal to exert pressure on the defenders so that they would surrender as quick as possible, it was advisable to try one's luck in a night attack from time to time. The chances of success were not too great if the town had a working watch system, but long hours on guard over a long period of time exhausted the defenders. A watchman might fall asleep or let his mind wander. Although the chances of success were small, with every attack, the townspeople were brutally reminded of the fact that they wouldn't be able to beat off every assault forever. And they knew that a town taken by storm suffered much harsher conditions than one surrendering in time. Because of that, every assault increased the chance of surrender. In contrast to such small operations, a major upcoming assault was visible and open to the defenders' eye in the face of its preparation. The purpose of preparations, including ceremonial acts and religious services, the dubbing of new knights and loud proclamations, was to put up a threatening scene. This was more powerful than any spoken or written word. It was the entire army flexing its collective muscles. When the banners formed up and took their positions, the world paused for a moment. Normally, the defenders were given the chance to surrender, and surely some must have been thinking hard about it. If they didn't surrender, the attack began. The sound of trumpets and drums announced the end of waiting. War cries and horns sounded, the banners tilted forward, and the men advanced. Because protection was more important than agility, the well-armored man led the attack. In addition to armor and shields, the soldiers carried or pushed wooden screens to protect themselves. The attackers had to take the same route as in the first hasty assault, through the rain of enemy missiles up to the wall, up a ladder or siege tower, and then onto the wall walk. If the first assault failed, new waves moved against the walls until the attackers were exhausted or had to give up for some other reason. Meanwhile, the slow and ponderous siege towers were set in motion. all while the defenders' missiles were raining down on them. Both armies were watching with great suspension, the defenders cheering when a stone hit, groaning if it missed. From the Siege of Acre we know that the attackers danced in joy when the enemy's stone throwers missed. However, the joy was short-lived, since it turned out that the trebuchets on the walls did not fire stones but pots of flammable liquid. Flaming arrows soon lit the tower and the crew died in flames. Meanwhile, archers, crossbowmen, slingers and the like took their position at a reasonable distance, also covered by mantlets of wicker and wood. On the walls, each opening in the battlements was assigned to a number of shooters, so that a dense rain of projectiles forced the defenders to keep their heads down. This was where the elevated platform of the siege tower came in especially handy, by providing suppressing fire from above. Again, action was multi-dimensional. While waves of infantry were running against the wall and archers were providing cover, miners were trying to undermine it directly. Covered by wooden shelters, they worked to directly penetrate the base of the wall. This was nearly impossible if the wall was made of big solid blocks of stone, but there are cases in which they succeeded to carve out a niche, for example with walls of brick, adobe or masonry faced earth. Then they either dug further down to undermine the foundations or tried to weaken the construction directly on ground level. Again, the chances of breaching the wall were small, but there are cases in which it worked out. A breach was most likely to be caused by deep mining. Once the wall was breached, the besiegers would advance to storm it. But sometimes the rubble hindered an assault or made it even impassable. Then it had to be cleared first, which was often a costly matter because the workers had to be paid extra for the dangerous work. And even if the breach was cleared fairly well, remnants of walls and debris were a significant obstacle. In addition, a breach or an open gate were still bottlenecks. Only a small number of men could push through at the same time, and they were likely to face the hand-picked elite fighters of the defenders, all while being battered by stones, arrows and bolts from nearby towers and walls. The attackers' bowmen, in contrast, usually did not have the advantage of an elevated position, and thus couldn't shoot without risking to hit their comrades. The balance of power in such situations is probably best shown by several examples in which the defenders left their gates open on purpose. Going through a breach was a daunting prospect. Success was far from guaranteed, and casualties were usually very high. Because of this, storms of breaches were often a make or break moment. Sometimes it took a lot of persuasion to get the men to attack. A famous example is James the Conqueror's siege of the city of Medina, Mallorca, modern-day Palma de Mallorca, during the Spanish Reconquista. After weeks of mining, the besiegers opened a breach in the wall. James the Conqueror took 4 days to prepare the assault. He positioned his veteran footmen in the front and the knights behind them. Each one had to swear an oath that they wouldn't turn around if they were wounded. Still, no one moved when the order to attack was given. Only after 3 calls to action, the army began to march. When they finally entered the breach, where a phalanx of spearmen waited for them, neither side dared attack him. But then the knights advanced to the front and threw their horses against the enemy pikes. The first wave was deterred, but the second one pushed into the breach. There, the fight came to a standstill, with the soldiers on both sides densely packed in the area of the breach. Finally, the horsemen made another attempt and broke through. Soon after, the city fell. If no negotiation, no bombardment, and no mine yielded any fruit, and it became evident that not even the most determined assault would crack the city, the besiegers' last resort was a full blockade. The siege became a game of attrition. It was all about letting the defenders exhaust their supplies and weakening them until they gave in. However, this involved costs and risks not all attacking armies could afford. While a blockade was important at any stage of the siege, as it prevented a beleaguered garrison from receiving reinforcements and supplies or food, now it became the main means of the besiegers. If not already done, the besieging army would now try to cut off the town completely, most often by building a complete circumvallation. This meant that a ditch, a rampart, or both were built around the whole town and guarded at all times. In addition, efforts were often made to interfere with the defenders' water supplies, for example by destroying conduits or even by diverting streams or rivers. Because encircling and starving a town was a very lengthy process, the camp would be improved and logistics stabilized. In some cases, the siege camp would itself grow to resemble a small town, with walls, wooden houses, a marketplace, artisans, brothels, shops, and so on. When food became scarce and hunger widespread, pressure on the defenders rose tremendously. Tensions began to build, as not all had to lose equally much. In contrast to the townspeople, the men of the garrison had a castle to retreat to, and usually no family and home to lose. The besiegers knew this all too well and tried to instigate the townspeople to give up. The attackers hoped to cause quarrels among the people within the walls, or even to incite a traitor to let them in. If the commander of the defense and the garrison kept control, people soon began to die of hunger and thirst. In such dire situations, desperate measures were taken. To stretch food and supplies, the garrison sometimes forced the so-called useless mouths, children, women, and elderly people to leave the city. While a merciful commander might let them escape, a good tactician didn't. This way, they were caught between the lines and the defenders had either to watch their own people starve or feed them of their scarce reserves. This happened, for example, during the Siege of Rouen in 1417. According to the historian Juliet Baker, 12,000 people were expelled from the city. The refugees were forced to live in the ditches through winter, neither permitted to leave nor to return to the city. The sight of this misery even troubled the English besiegers. Hunger, as well as disease, were a threat to both besieged and besiegers. Especially if the sewage systems were improvised and fresh water limited, disease could easily spread and inflict losses higher than a full-blown battle. It took good preparations and some luck to go through a siege without having an epidemic. The same goes for crowded towns. It seems, however, that epidemics were less common on the side of the besieged, probably because they had better shelter, working sanitation, and were used to the local microorganisms. Generally speaking, a siege could end in three ways. Either the besieged army abandoned it at some point, the fortress was taken by storm, or the defenders surrendered. If the siege ended in an agreement of surrender, the town wasn't handed over immediately though. The contract often included a so-called conditional respite, which means that the defenders were given the chance to appeal to their lord for help one last time. For the duration of this last respite, there was a truce. No shots were exchanged, no blows dealt, no repairs made in this time. If the agreed time had passed, the keys to the city were handed over in a formal ceremony, and the victor could make his entry into the town. Depending on how the attackers deemed the town's conduct during the siege, it would simply change possession, or it would be plundered. If the town surrendered without permission of the garrison, they might burn it from their refuge, punishing the townspeople for their cowardice and treachery. But more often, they simply made their last stand or negotiated separate terms. Then they handed their fortress over in exchange for permission to depart unharmed, with their possessions or even under arms with flying colors. If a town was taken by assault, its worst nightmares were to become true. The victorious soldiers, sometimes even encouraged by their commanders, treated the inhabitants brutally. They considered raping and looting their well-earned right. This was even worse when the two adversaries hated each other anyways, for example because of religious differences. Where it was allowed to take slaves, bloodlust was overcome by the lust for profit. Unfortunately, these darkest hours of a siege are most often only described by our sources in very general terms, such as everyone was put to the sword. But all in all, it seems that after an initial killing spree, the soldiers usually only killed those who resisted. After a short period of time, often 3 days, the sack was called to a halt. The townspeople now had the chance to accept their new lord, or keep at least their homes. Sometimes, however, they were expelled and their homes redistributed or burned to the ground. Please use the information provided in this video wisely and responsibly. Only plunder peasants, bombard towns, and undermine buildings if absolutely necessary. Since we expect you to profit greatly from the practical information we provided, we think it would only be fair if we get a share. Please consider donating via Patreon.
Rome was a mess, and I mean that on every level. Living in Rome was messy, dealing with Rome was messy, and in our case, talking about Rome is messy. Admittedly, that's like 80% of the fun with them, because there is no single history of Rome. The perspective of every era, every province, every social class, and every outsider is completely different. Instead, my goal today is to tell a complete history of Rome as a Mediterranean civilization state, not just looking at warfare, nor literature, nor politics, nor architecture. Man, I wish. And certainly not imperial tabloid scandal, but a history of the idea of Rome. The collective consciousness that defines the Senatus Populusque Romanus, the Senate and people of Rome. Those four letters, SPQR, weren't just a moniker the Romans called themselves, it was a communal promise that remained true throughout centuries of evolution and change. And qualities like that make Rome feel really special. There's honestly nothing like it, and I think it's important to appreciate not just what Rome became, but how much slow, careful, calculated effort was put into its cultivation and preservation. As we'll see in a minute, early Roman history is a notoriously slow burn, as generation after generation dedicated themselves to something they'd never see the end of. And I just think that's really cool. So, as we start from the very beginning of the Roman story and weave our way through 2 millennia of glory, triumph, and deeply hilarious disasters, let's do some history. Rome was not built in a day, but it was built consciously and with intentionality. Roman civilization as we understand it is the product of millions of people, men and women, young and old, weak and powerful, working over millennia to make their culture something spectacular. We can see that they built and accomplished amazing things across 3 continents, but what's less obvious is what they built on. Not literally, mind you, that's usually brick or stone, but what cultural foundation sustains so huge an idea as Rome? That's the kind of question that takes us to the very beginnings of their history as we try to figure out what inciting incident led to all of this. However, any records from the earliest Roman chronicles are agonizingly absent, as the city was sacked and burned in 390 by a tribe of Gauls, so we are instead left at the mercy of Roman legend, completely ahistorical and hella propaganda. But despite this rather considerable setback in understanding the earliest roots of Roman history, we can work with this, because later Romans also didn't know where exactly they came from, and were voraciously curious to fix that. So lacking a verifiable answer, they instead concocted one, consciously and intentionally compiling a narrative out of half-remembered myths and historical foreshadowing of the later Rome they knew. This web of folktales, retold and refined by centuries of storytellers until their codification around the turn of the millennium, is our best source of cultural intent and ambition for the Rome that was to be. So, let's untangle this Roman creation myth to better understand the underlying roots of Rome. If we take the Romans at their word, their origins goeth thusly. 1100 something or other BC, Troy's on fire and one lucky Prince Aeneas escaped. He made his way to Italy with interruptions and won kingship of the plain of Latium, but it's not Rome time quite yet. His descendants ruled in Alba Longa, a short way south of the Tiber River, for 4 centuries until the Alban king Numitor got deposed by his brother Amulius, who made Numitor's daughter Rhea Silvia a Vestal Virgin to ensure the bloodline ends with her. This was always a failing strategy when Olympians were afoot, and sure enough, the war god Mars slid in to give her twin sons Romulus and Remus. Amulius demanded they be killed river style, but they were saved at the banks of the Tiber by a she-wolf, who then nursed them through early childhood before they were taken in by shepherds, bringing the twins' parent count to 1 dad, 2 moms, 1 god, and a wolf. They grew up and deposed that nasty awful Amulius, and later set about founding a new settlement along the Tiber. A brotherly quarrel escalated as they were plotting out the course of their new walls, and Romulus killed Remus in the first but distinctly not last Roman on Roman violence. That, kids, is why it's called Rome and not dream. With his kingship secure and the city founded in the year 753, Romulus got to populating his new town, so he welcomed bandits, exiles, and other such ruffians, and then captured the Sabine women en masse to ensure Rome would have heirs. Unlike Rhea Silvia, we can't all be slammed by the god of war, but the Romans sure learned from his example. Romulus also implemented several core features of Roman society: the tribes, patrician and plebeian classes, marriage laws, the patron-client system, even the Senate arose as if springing fully formed from the head of Romulus. After him, 6 more kings ruled over Rome, the last 3 of whom were from the Etruscan Tarquinii clan, and the very last was Tarquinius Superbus, aka Tarquitarch Superbus, who was a total knob. His incessant assholery enraged the Romans into throwing their very first coup d'etat, very exciting, ousting Tarquin and establishing Rome as a republic in 509 BC. From there, the Italian peninsula was destined to one day fall under the stunning force of Rome's military and kick-ass civic institutions, and the whole Mediterranean would undoubtedly be next. This origin story is dignified, tidy, a little self-indulgent, but above all else, convenient. So let's go through this and, rip it apart. First off, Rome's founding date of 753 is a guess, posited in the 1st century BC to roughly line up with the earliest Greek Olympics. As far as the story itself goes, the Italy-bound journey of Aeneas, the perfect Roman OC, do not steal, is suspiciously Odyssean enough as is, but it's first attested by Greek sources during the Republic. Aeneas is also way back in the Bronze Age compared to 753. That hefty 4th-century gap between Aeneas and Romulus went largely unexplained until Dionysius of Halicarnassus seemingly invented the entire concept of the Alban kings in his Roman Antiquities from the 1st century BC. The kings of Alba Longa have very little characterization, and some can be mapped onto nearby Latium place names, so it's not a stretch to think Dionysius decided that hill over there is totally derived from this ancient king, you guys. I promise. Don't Google it. I promise. Please don't investigate it. It's only when we run into the twins' backstory that the Alban kings Numitor and Amulius actually do anything. The boy's story is overtly mythical, and even Livy questions Mars and the wolf, but what might be less believable than divine parentage is the idea that 7 kings ruled Rome for a combined 244 years, which requires an unbroken string of 7 35-year reigns on average. That is a royal runtime matched by only 2 emperors before the fall of Western Rome. And yes, that of all things is where I draw the realism line, because each segment of the story feels abundantly retrofitted to clean up a messy set of chronologies between key events: the well-known establishment of the Republic in 509, the vaguely understood foundation of the city in the mid-700s-ish, and the heavily mythologized Trojan origins of Aeneas back in the Bronze Age. Everything else is just narrative scaffolding. Republican-era Romans wondered aloud how exactly their history could fit 2 founders in the same folk tradition, and it took until the Augustan period to square all that by having Aeneas found the Roman dynasty and Romulus build the city itself. Other classical states didn't struggle this much with contradicting narratives. Athens certainly didn't mind having multiple founder heroes, and one of them was Theseus. Ugh. But in the 1st century BC, Rome took an organic storytelling tradition and forced all those disparate threads to play by history's rules. One continuous narrative. It didn't need to be what we would call factual, it just needed to fit. Of course the Alban kings were retconned into existence to tidy up the timeline. Aeneas and Romulus are the only 2 who narratively matter. Rome's legendary origins only needed to make sense to the Romans, and in the absence of records from before Rome's first sack in 390 BC, that's the closest thing to a primary source we have. As pure history, it's bound to leave us wanting anything more substantive, but as an artifact of their culture, this origin tells us everything the Romans needed to know about themselves and wanted anyone else to know. Their heroes are divine descendants of Venus and Mars, their lineage runs back as far as anywhere in Greece, they come from disparate places and backgrounds, civil war is in their blood, they 100% have a wolf kink, and they kill tyrants. That's Rome. Everything else is Livy's filler arcs. Now, for a supposedly ancient story, 2 of Romulus' deeds point decidedly forwards in Roman history and reveal what later Romans thought must have been intrinsic to their identity. His first act as king was to welcome Italy's dispossessed and outlaws as Rome's citizens, which may seem rather unheroic on the face of it, but this reflects Rome's most peculiar trait, its openness to cultures and people. Rome, of course, thought that it was the best civilization ever and made that known loudly and frequently, but Rome took good ideas where wherever they found them, and was willing to let any barbarian become Roman so long as they took on Rome's customs and learned Latin. Romans always started as outsiders, be they exiles from across Italy or refugees from far-off Troy, supposedly. Rome was also remarkably comfortable with granting citizenship to freed slaves, a quality the Greeks absolutely did not share. This seemingly undignified story actually enshrines the idea that regardless of social class or cultural boundaries, it was possible to become a Roman. And that idea is the stuff that pan-Mediterranean civilizations are made of. But alongside Rome's great aspirations, their deepest anxiety is also present in the Romulus story, as their ruinously blood-soaked hobby of civil wars finds its start in that fratricidal founder. Rather than being intended as justification to go out murdering as if they needed that, this looks like the closest thing to Rome's original sin, the foundational crime they will be doomed to repeat over and over and over and over and over for more than 2,000 years. These stories take their most permanent form 7 centuries after the supposed founding of the city in the pages of Livy's History of Rome and Virgil's Aeneid. And as we wait for potential discoveries in archaeology to illuminate the earliest settlements amid those hills beside the Tiber, that's all we've got to go on. The image sharpens into historical focus as we depose King Tarquin, start the Republic, and embark on the slow process of building Rome's civic institutions and establishing a domain across central Italy, but the further we progress along the timeline, the more meaningful and relevant their origin story becomes. The roots of Rome ultimately tell us nothing about the earliest Romans, if they even called themselves Romans, even came from Troy, even had kings, even did any of the things their myths take for granted. But this narrative reveals so much about the civilization they would become and the kind of people the Romans would one day be. Crafty bastards. As the next 2,000 years will amply demonstrate, they were crafty bastards. What's important to keep in mind as we start laying down more and more red paint on this lovely marble map is that Rome did not begin with a grand plan of conquest. Rather, after shaking off Etruscan domineering and suffering their first major incursion of the Gauls in 390 by Brennus, the Romans needed to fortify their territory by pacifying threats at their frontier. Simply put, this process began and never finished. Individuals had their social or political motives for participating, but at scale, this doctrine of expanding defense just kept on expanding. Rome did not have some 53.5-step plan for Mediterranean domination imposed from the top, but a set of priorities which successive generations inherited and renewed. This defensively expansionist military philosophy carved through Etruria, Samnia, Magna Graecia, Carthage, Macedonia, Gaul, Syria, Egypt, Germania, and Parthia. There would always be another enemy to fear. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Rome handled its enemies one at a time, and so will we. A majority of Rome's early history was simply a spirited back and forth between its neighbors, the Etruscans to the north, the Samnites to the south, and later on, the Greek colonies of Magna Graecia to the way further south. And by spirited, I do literally mean they were stabbing each other with spears. While all of this neighborly, murdery business was going on, the city of Rome was building itself up both physically and institutionally, with walls, streets, a sewer system, stone temples and buildings, a governmental system reminiscent of the Greek polis system, and a religious system reminiscent of the Greek pantheon. Man, that Greek influence really got in there early. Institutionally speaking, by the time they kicked out Tarquin and swore never to have a king again, a lot of the mechanics of the Republic were already in place, like the Senate, the patrician nobility, and the citizen assembly. The transition to a republic was really more of a reorganization of authority than a political revolution or anything like that. Broadly speaking, the whole idea was to take their government and publicize the power so the people could participate, and the word republic comes from the Latin res publica, which just means public thing. Structurally, the government was controlled by 2 annually elected consuls, the praetors ran the justice system, and the quaestors, the silliest Roman name ever, managed state finances. The aediles were responsible for the state of the city, so they handled food, games, infrastructure, all that jazz. The Senate, though it didn't technically legislate anything, published opinions on policy that were often very quickly put in place by their respective officers down the chain. Almost all of these magistrates and senators in the early republic were of the patrician nobility. If you happened to be one of Rome's many plebeians, you might have rightly felt a little left out of the supposed res publica. The plebeians unsurprisingly wanted political and social rights, and they were determined to acquire them. So on any given season of campaigning against Rome's bothersome neighbors, the plebeians, who composed the majority of the army, simply went on strike. They'd just go sit on a hill and wait until the Senate granted them the right to marry patricians, or to have their own government positions in a special assembly, or to elect their own members of that special assembly, or to serve as consul. And then by 287 BC, the plebeians and the patricians were equal in everything but name. good for them. The government of the Roman Republic simultaneously had elements of a monarchy, an aristocracy, and a democracy. This mixed constitution and its flexibility in governance, according to the historian Polybius, was one of Rome's greatest strengths, and I'm inclined to agree. Rome's institutions were its backbone for over 2,000 years, and you need a backbone like that to hard carry an entire civilization. Okay, enough of the politicky stuff, back to the stabby stuff. Now, like I said, early Roman Republican history is a notoriously slow burn. The struggle for plebeians' rights took over 2 centuries, and conquering the Italian peninsula was similarly slow going. Rome was intent on being careful, taking small steps, and taking its time. Compare this to the aftermath of the Macedonian conquest happening just a short ways east. When you go too far too fast, things tend to fracture. Rome spent most of the 4th and early 3rd centuries fighting with various neighbors and working its way down to only the Bay of Naples. That's a pretty short way to go in so long a time. Call it careful, call it as fast as a small state like Rome could hope to go anyway. Either way, it worked. Key to Rome's military strategy was that aforementioned doctrine of expanding defense. Essentially, Rome would never be so brash as to go out and attack someone. Good heavens, no. Rome had the good manners to only fight in self-defense, and they knew that their gods would only grant them victory if their war was a just and pious war. But if Rome suspected that someone was going to attack them, Rome would absolutely shoot first. Defensively, of course. A preemptive retaliatory strike, if you will. And that is how you go on to conquer the entire world defensively. By 280, Rome had successfully yoinked all of Samnium and proceeded to set its sights at Magna Graecia in southern Italy. Magna Graecia, not being the biggest fans of the Romans and wishing to keep their land, thank you very much, sent for help from Greece proper, and they brought in the big guns. Specifically, they imported the Hellenistic king Pyrrhus of Epirus. Pyrrhus fought 2 battles against the Romans, and even though he won both of them, his losses were so devastating that he bailed on the campaign. After a detour through Sicily, he fought the Romans again, lost, and went home for good. Pyrrhus's abilities to win battles, coupled with his inability to not burn through 1/3 of his army in the process, is what gives us the term Pyrrhic victory. So, good on Pyrrhus for eternally tethering his name to the military equivalent of pulling 5 consecutive all-nighters to cram for a test. Yeah, it's a win, but was it worth it? Yeah, so with pretty much no one left to protect Magna Graecia, Rome proceeded to swoop in and colonize all over the place. And unlike those who employ the torch it and start over method of conquest, the Romans had a political motive to be kind-ish toward conquered peoples, keeping existing systems in place and not rocking the boat too badly. Except for this next example from a rather salty chapter in Roman history, the Punic Wars against Carthage. The first war can be roughly attributed to a miscommunication with some Sicilian pirates. While Carthage and Rome may have been destined to fight each other at some point or another, they ultimately came to blows on account of both being called into Sicily to settle a fight between the city of Syracuse and some rowdy pirates. Rome and Carthage kind of just tripped face first into war and spent most of the 23-year-long war not actually fighting each other. The issue was Carthage had been a long-standing naval power in the Mediterranean, but Rome had no navy to speak of, so Rome really needed a navy, and quick. This is another of many instances